I am a proud SUNY graduate, Binghamton University, or SUNY Binghamton as it was known then, 1992, so you can either feel pride or regret in that, depending on what you think of my book and our conversation we have today. It was Robert Maynard Hutchins, the very well-known president of the University of Chicago, who wrote in his 1930s book, The Idea of the University, still a very modern approach to thinking about higher education. And the book begins along the lines of, the most important thing to understand about the university is the confusion that besets it. In many ways, the first part of my book, which is a history of American higher education, is the story of that confusion, where it came from, and what it continues to still mean today. And I think I don't believe anything that it says, that the book says about the history of American higher education is really all that contested or controversial. I claim no original scholarship. Many of the ideas have been represented in books of higher education history that have been used for a long time. The book talks quite a bit about how in the formational period of American higher education in the late 19th century, we decided or allowed to happen an organizational model that stuffed together three essential purposes. The research university, which came from Germany, the mission of practical training, which represented in policies like the Morrill Land-Grant Act, and the broader ideals of liberal education. Not my framework. You can go back to Lawrence Veazey's seminal history of American higher education, the emergence of the American university, which was published 50 years ago, actually, still a wonderful book and still in print, to read about how that happened. And to me, the interesting thing is that almost as soon as that happened, people inside the academy kind of looked at the system and said, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to try to put together a research university and a liberal arts college and an organization that's meant to train people for practical fields for the labor market all in one place. William James, the famous pragmatist philosopher, Henry James's brother, wrote an essay called The PhD Octopus in 1901, I believe, where he made the commonsensical observation that the things that you had to do in order to earn a PhD had really nothing to do with whether or not you were ever going to be good in the classroom. He said it was a sham, a bauble, a dodge, which I picked as the title of the second chapter of my book, meant to throw dust in the eyes of the public, to fool people into thinking that the university was something other than it wasn't. Of course, Jacques Barzun, probably one of the most famous college professors in American history, taught the great books at Columbia in the 1930s and 40s and had a career that went all the way into the end of the century. In his book, Teacher in America, has a chapter called The PhD Octopus, basically his way of signaling his continued heated agreement with what William James had said 30 years prior, made all the same points. But by that point, it was much, much too late, really, for the university organizational model to change. There's sort of a well-known phenomenon where once organizations become a certain way, they become more like one another over time. This is just kind of basic organizational theory. So the question that interested me was why it has persisted for so long. These kinds of things happen all the time. Organizations form in certain ways, they get used to the way they are, and then eventually someone comes along with some new way of doing things and the world changes. And yet, virtually everything that Robert Maynard Hutchins said about the university in 1934, you could say about universities now, 80 years later. Why is that? I believe that it has a lot less to do with the virtues of the model and the inevitability of the higher education model as we know today, then kind of an epic string of good luck that in some ways I don't think we can expect to continue. It was, of course, a great virtue that the American university model was made in America and not, say, in Europe, where many of the great higher education institutions were decimated during the catastrophe of the beginning of the 20th century. Our universities were in the ascendant industrial power of the age, in a tremendously wealthy, growing nation, a nation of immigrants where people were looking for means to uplift their children and saw colleges and universities as the way that you would do that. The first nation in the world to decide that it would be a good idea to try to get everybody through high school. A nation with a Congress that, in a sort of basic attempt to try to find something to do with returning veterans when they came back from World War II, why don't we send them to college and see how that works out? A nation that decided to fight the Cold War by providing billions upon billions of dollars to research universities in order to conduct the research necessary to compete with the Soviet Union. So my argument is that that wave of money and enrollment and good fortune overwhelmed whatever internal contradictions might have been there all along, and that we're really only now in a time where in some ways those historical moments of good luck have receded. And I'll add one more. The economy changed around us. So you get to the point in the history of American higher education in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of social dissatisfaction with the institution, some real doubts inside the academy about whether the institution would continue. There was a very famous book published in the early 1970s called The Overeducated American, where a Harvard economist predicted that we were producing too many college graduates and we were about to enter a period in which their wages would decline. Well, of course, exactly the opposite thing happened after that, because we were then in the midst of deindustrialization and globalization and the transition from a society where deunionization, a transition from a society where you could earn a middle income with just a high school diploma to the world we live in now, where you certainly can't. And the only way that you can have even a fighting chance in the American economy is to have some kind of post-secondary credential. And the only organizations that are allowed to issue those credentials, the only organizations that are allowed to access public subsidies are colleges and universities as we've known them for a long time. So I feel that the flaws have been there for a long time, but the consequences and the stakes are much higher now than they've ever been before. And those same internal contradictions that really weighted the attentions and the culture of the university against the core mission of undergraduate learning, which is borne out in most of the research that we have around how much students learn in college. I think probably a lot of us are familiar with Richard Arum and Josip Roxa's very interesting work of sociology, Academically Adrift, that came out a few years ago. The newest numbers from the OECD that compare the sort of just foundational math and reading skills of the average American college graduate to the average college graduate in other countries, including, I should say, other countries that graduate more people from college than us, not less, and finds that the average American college graduate doesn't look very good compared to his or her peers in other countries. All of that, I would argue, is at root a function of that confusion, and a confusion that causes institutions to not take their essential mission to provide rigor and coherence and attention to their undergraduate educational mission as seriously as they ought to. So this is the point in the book where information technology kind of intersects with these long-term trends, and the rest of it really is talking about how things have changed in information technology, how there are all kinds of things that are possible now that were not possible even a few years ago. You know, I acknowledge that by talking about this, I join a long and kind of ignoble roster of people who have predicted that every new kind of information technology would surely overthrow the college as we know it. Thomas Edison said that high schools would become obsolete because we would just show students movies a long time ago, and he turned out not to be right about that. But I believe fundamentally that this time is different. I think that the kinds of the information technology environment we're in now is very, very different than when the best we could do was have college on the radio or college over cable television, that the nature of interactivity, that the computational power, that the ability to create authentic human communities in a combination of a virtual space and a real space is much, much, much different than it used to be. So we both have the opportunity to create learning environments that are actually substantially better than some of the learning environments that students experience now. And I'll sort of pause for a moment and urge everyone as we talk about the nature of learning to keep in mind the large distinction between the consensus view of what the best learning environment is and what the learning environment that most college students actually experience in most of our institutions. I would argue that there is a large distance between the two of them. And so if we're going to think about what's possible in the future, we can't say, well, this, that, or the other vision of technology-enabled education could never be good as my memory of my one great class that I had in college, because we tend to remember the one great class we had in college, and we tend to not remember the very many unmemorable education experiences that we had, and often really it was much more of the latter than the former. And then the other thing that we need to think about is just the basic issue of how not only can we do better educationally in some cases, we can do the same for many more people for a lot less money. And that's important. We cannot ignore the economics of higher education in all of this. As part of the book, I took a MOOC, a word I think everyone became instantly tired of hearing a few years ago, something that went through the kind of classic cycle of overpraise and then disappointment, but which nonetheless I believe represents a very, very important and ongoing development in American higher education. So mostly as kind of a narrative device, if you read the book, and I hope you will, I took an entire MIT genetics class through the edX platform. I don't represent my learning experience as representative of anything other than myself. Learners are different in many, many, many different ways. What I think is noteworthy about the fact that I took this MIT genetics class is the one thing I'm sure of is that my experience was in no important way different than the experience of the students who were taking the same class in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's a very kind of straightforward approach to pedagogy that they use for these introductory classes in MIT, which is, of course, one of many approaches, but not exactly an uncommon one. It was a lecture-based class, a very good lecture-based class. I think we've all sort of, in some ways, learned to denigrate the lecture as kind of bad pedagogy, but good lectures can be really good. Tautological, but true nonetheless. This was a lecture that was taught by a man named Eric Lander, who helped lead the Human Genome Project in the 1990s. He's been teaching the introductory biology, which at MIT is essentially introduction to genetics class, for going on 20 years. He's as up-to-date in the field as it's possible to be, changes the class every year because genetics changes every year. So in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 100 students took, real freshmen at MIT took this class. They taped all of the lectures, and then about 2 weeks later, tens of thousands of people around the world, including myself, watched the same lectures. Did exactly the same problem sets, did exactly the same homework assignments, took exactly the same exams. I actually went up to Cambridge to see the class in person. I was kind of curious, is there something I'm missing by not being there? I interviewed a bunch of the students afterwards to kind of get a sense of how they took the class. I interviewed Eric Lander and some of the teaching assistants. I really wanted to sort of be sure I was right about this, and what they all told me was the same thing. They said, look, this class, I went to the lectures. I went back, I talked to some of my fellow students, which I could easily do in the online forums that they had edX had set up. I worked very, very hard on the problem sets, which is really the core of the learning experience in that kind of introductory science class. And I took the exams. That's how they teach that class at MIT. And you can replicate that essentially perfectly at a marginal cost to the last student of nothing. Probably cost them a couple $100,000 to produce the class, quote unquote. They put it out there, and now anyone can take it for free. So the combination, I think, of the fact that we can reach so many more people for so much less money, and in certain elements, but certain important elements of higher education, the fact that the reach of information technology continues to expand, the fact that we can predict confidently that these smart people in places like Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, who have been trying very hard to put together neuroscience and cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence into really serious attempts to make the experience of learning in a technology-enabled environment much, much more than what I did, which was just watch lecture videos and solve problems. We can predict with confidence that certain kinds of trends are going to continue in certain kind of directions. More people will have access to better technology. Our use of technology educationally is going to continue to improve. The genie is out of the bottle in terms of the best, quote unquote, or most prestigious is probably more accurate, American colleges and universities putting their good name behind these kinds of educational experiences. And when you put that together, that's what you put all those things together, and that's what produces what I characterize in the book as the University of Everywhere. Here's what I mean by that specifically. I have a daughter. She's 4.5. She's about to turn 5. And the question that sort of animated me when I wrote the book was, what will college be like when she turns 18? Will it be pretty much just the same it was when I turned 18? Or will it be something substantially different? And I, in the end, came down on the substantially different side of things. If she was turning 18 today, she would have basically 2 options. She could go to a traditional college or university, or she could engage in some kind of mostly purely online version of that wouldn't be as good. And so she would go to the traditional one, and I would spend whatever amount of money my wife and I could put together, and probably, if we were typical, borrow a bunch more money, and she would go. 15 years from now, when she goes to college, here's what I think will be different. I think she will still have the option of going to traditional institutions, many of which will frankly be still trying to charge even more money and compete viciously with one another for the very last full-pay student out there, wherever he or she is. Out of state, overseas, somewhere, there's got to be someone who will write a check for the full amount of money. There will be, I don't even want to say online, because I think that our sense of what online means is going to change quite a lot. You can't assume that the nature of interacting with technology 20 years from now is going to be like this thing that we do now. The way that we interact as humans with machines will evolve over time in ways that will be more human, not less, as we go forward. And then I think we now have the opportunity to create, and this is the thing I'm in many ways most excited about, new higher learning organizations that provide all of the hugely important yet not quite as specific intangible benefits of belonging to an authentic human learning community. I think people, when they turn 18, will still want to leave the home and go somewhere, have what I had as a SUNY student, live among other people my age, have coming of age experiences, go out on weekends, learn some things, fall in love. All those people will still want to do all of those things. But you can create places that provide that experience and take advantage, both pedagogically and economically, of the immense wealth of educational resources that will be available via technology, and put them together into an organization that I think will be both more effective and a lot less expensive. You're not going to have to pay the increasingly high toll for admission to these walled gardens of learning that we've erected over the last couple of centuries to get a, quote, college education. In many ways, the traditional model is fundamentally a product of scarcity. If you wanted to get a good college education, you needed access to 3 things. You needed to be where the other students were. You needed to be where a critical mass of scholars and mentors and teachers were. And you needed to be someplace that could afford to take advantage of the best information technology of the time, which was the printed book. And all those things cost a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to build a place where you could have enough students and people. It costs a lot of money to buy all the books worth reading. And I think because that had to be scarce, we've all kind of, on some level, willingly or unwillingly, internalized this idea of scarcity in higher education, and thus this notion that we should judge colleges by how many people they don't let in. We are right now in the middle of making a very profound transformation from a time of scarcity to a time of abundance in education resources. And I really do think that will change fundamentally the kinds of educational organizations that are possible and that will become over this time. Not just here in the United States, but around the world. Probably the single most important thing that's happened on planet Earth over the last 40 years has been the decline in global poverty. In 1980, 52%, I believe, of all the people on Earth were below the poverty line of $1.25 a day. That number is now down around 20%, even as the population of the Earth grew to 7 billion people. So the kind of middle ground estimate is that between now and 2030, 3 billion people will join the global middle class. That's more people than have ever been to college in all of human history. And the first thing that you want for your children, once you can provide safety and healthcare and food and shelter is education. We cannot educate those 3 billion people by building millions of American-style colleges and universities. We can barely afford to do that here in the richest nation on earth. So it's not just, this isn't just going to happen. The university of everywhere isn't just going to be in our own society. I think in many ways it will be these fantastically growing and dynamic developing societies that won't even ask themselves some of these questions about what do we do with the older institutions and how do we change them. They will move right to the new as fast as they can. And that is going to be a reality that we can take advantage of, but that we also need to be aware of, because they're not going to wait for us to resolve the arguments that we've been having around our higher learning systems for a long time. So I'm very optimistic. I think it's an opportunity for American higher education institutions, which are the unchallenged leaders in global learning, to be the leaders in global learning in the future. But we're going to have to look outward, not inward. We're going to have a much broader sense of possibility about what a college or a university can be and ought to be and is obliged to be, given the world that we live in. And I think that it can happen and it can emanate from our public institutions. I fundamentally believe that in the public purpose and public good of higher education. But we need more institutions, and we need better institutions, and we need institutions that are much less confused than they have been. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and looking forward to talking with my fellow panelists.